So, right, David, tell me a little bit more about one thing which I think is fundamental to all of these conversations, which is the definition of innovation. How do you define innovation?
Well, I was fortunate, I think, to have a rather unusual education. I did both sciences and classics right through my school days. And
Proper
in fact,
old British education.
Yeah, well, definitely from the days,
Yeah.
many years before I went through. I was one of the last bastions of a classics education for a scientist. And when I came to Cambridge University, I really couldn't decide initially whether I wanted to do natural sciences or classics. So with that background, innovation, from the Latin nova, new, clearly anything new would fall under the broadest definition of innovation. But much of that I've perhaps rather pejoratively called incremental innovation. So just changing something a little, making it a little cheaper, a little bit more efficient. And I tend to exclude that from the definition of what you might call true innovation, a step change, something completely new as a solution to a problem. And that's my definition of innovation, a big change.
Yeah, a big change, a step change. And one thing that I think you mentioned is this kind of introduction of novelty to a system. How important is the introduction part of that? Because I come from the commercial world where clearly, if you come up with an invention, that's nice, but unless you do something with it, you haven't innovated.
Absolutely, and that's absolutely right. Scientists in particular are very guilty of assuming that the technical component of the entire process is the only one. If we can solve the technical solution, then we're fine. But it doesn't work like that unless we get that out into the hands of the users, unless we persuade them to use it, unless we demonstrate that it's actually useful in their hands. The innovation cycle isn't complete. The inventor, the person who first thought, I wonder if we, invent a new vacuum cleaner with, no moving parts, and thinks how to do that, actually hasn't achieved the greatest problem at all, which is persuading people whether they needed a new one, whether they were prepared to pay for a new type of vacuum cleaner, whether it did actually perform better under the real world usage circumstances. So
do you think it's important then that you're almost applying this kind of design of solving from the problem back into the solution?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've written extensively about the difference between problem backwards versus where we are today forwards. The danger with where we are today, I know how to do this, what can I do with it, is that does lead to a rather incrementalist kind of approach. If you're going to make a step change, you have to leave behind where we currently are, look at what problems need to be solved, and then scan the horizon for the kinds of capabilities that you might bring together, perhaps in totally different ways to the people who are developing them right now. The person with that technology in a university or in a small company might be thinking that it was useful for one disease, but in actual fact you can see that it could be the technological solution to a problem which is a much bigger problem that's sitting over here.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, and that's a sort of side tangent, which I think a lot of the more interesting drugs on the market are the products of serendipity. Either they were, they turned left at some point in development, or they were on market and then found their more interesting niche.
Yeah.
How important is that kind of agility and serendipity within the drug discovery and development process?
Oh, I think it's absolutely essential. You can't it's not a linear pathway, it's a random walk, a guided random walk would be a better way of looking at it. I mean, the key insight really here came from Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning sort of psychological economist, who described situations like drug development as low validity environments, which essentially means the data available to you doesn't allow you to predict with any confidence what the right way forward is. So you have to keep trying things and abandoning things that don't look promising and moving through.
Which is interesting, isn't it? Because I've long been of the view that actually prediction is hard, especially when it comes to kind of this environment. But actually a lot of our processes are currently set up based on prediction.
Correct. Because that's the natural, it's human hubris. People don't like to admit that actually they've got next to no clue what they're actually doing. You don't get very far in this world if you stand up in front of the boss and go, yeah, I'm running an early stage discovery and development program, and yeah, like everyone else, I know probably 1% of the biology I need to know in order to be able to intervene with this system. You know, I'm going to do some fairly random things, and hopefully out of that something good will come up. And the next guy stands up and goes, well, I've got this process, and I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do the other. And you know, accountants and people from old economy businesses are much more comfortable with a process. They can be sold on the idea that there is much more predictive power than there is, and as a result they design whole companies around those kinds of rigid, siloed operations in which you assume that if I do, you know, ADME very, very well, and I do toxicology very, very well, and I do each node of activity very, very well in isolation, that somehow out of that I'm bound to end up at the right place. And because in drug development you never know whether you've actually been successful until the very end, and the very end no longer means did I get it approved, I mean, is anybody buying and using this thing, which may be not even now 7 or 8 years from inception, it might even be 15 years from inception. And because you've got no feedback at all about your relative success, you can keep kidding yourself that your predictive steps and that your powerful nodes are actually delivering you an outcome, when in actual fact it was serendipity and random chance that eventually led to the blockbuster.
Yeah, the good drugs happen almost by accident, and despite the companies rather than because of them. I mean, we've written before about this problem of these kind of stage gate, these toll gate processes, which are built on predictability. They're based on, you know, probabilities of technical success being typically 70% or 80%, because if they're lower, they don't get moved forward. But the record of success is way lower than that. So you know there is a feedback loop which you know is wrong currently, but no one's changing the system to reflect that.
Well, I think it's reflected. I think that the major issue with those kind of systems is that they only stop things when there is powerful evidence to stop, as opposed to setting them up so that you only continue if there's a powerful reason to continue. And it's sort of related to the sunk cost fallacy. I mean, where we're going now, it probably took months to organise the team of people who are going to work on this. You spent time developing a operating plan, persuading the board to give you money, and now we're 6 months in, and actually things don't look terribly promising, but you think, well, it took a lot of effort, and the beauty of biology is it's the infinite degrees of freedom. I can probably switch things around a little bit, maybe if we do this again, maybe if we do that, and that results in this overwhelming tendency for projects to shamble along. I mean, I've called them zombie projects, I think you've called them undead. I mean, you know, they're carrying on despite the fact that nobody is terribly enthusiastic about the prospects for success.
And sometimes good things happen there. I mean, that was what happened to Keytruda in essence, wasn't it? That it hit market despite the best efforts of a company that put it on the shelf for a long time. So.
But those stories though are the biggest poison in our industry, because once you start believing, you know, you hear the one in 1,000 occasion when a false negative, that is something that should have been killed, actually shambled through and turned out to be successful, as somehow a justification for keeping things going that don't look very promising. Actually, the vast majority of things that don't look very promising really are not very promising. And that mentality is super dangerous, because what kills us in drug development efficiency is not the things that we didn't bother with. It's actually the things that we did bother with that turn out to be useless. If I get a drug approved, I mean, I've called these busters rather than blockbusters, because if I spend all that money getting a drug approved and then nobody wants to buy it, well, I mean, that is absolutely catastrophic. If I had something that was actually going to be useful, but I just decided to leave it on the table in preclinical development, you know, as long as there's an infinite supply of plausible things to try, I've actually not damaged my efficiency, you know, at all.
Absolutely, that's interesting. So, one of the things that often isn't gotten right is the sort of breadth of exploration in early phase. How do you feel that pharma could be doing more to characterize what they have in their hands early?
Well, it's interesting to think about this problem, because I think years ago there wasn't enough breadth. Because if you believe in the predictability model, then you would have something which I think people have called pick the winners, which is you'd scout around, you'd have people looking at things, thinking very sagely, and then coming to the conclusion, this is the best project, this one is going to yield a really good drug, so we're going to put all our resources on that, and we're going to work really hard on that. And people tried that and then discovered that actually, due to the fact that we can't really predict what's going on because all the unknowns are so great, even the smartest, sagest people couldn't pick the right things. Then you move to the other extreme, which I've called kill the losers, which is essentially that you would start everything with, at each stage, all you eliminate are the things that are self-evidently rubbish. So, people present you a project that's based on incorrect data or incorrect assumptions, or they just didn't know something, and that can't work, kill it. Otherwise, everything else that looks plausible, give it a little bit of resource, move it forward a little bit, and keep going, keep pruning out the losers till eventually there's only one strand left, and hopefully you've got the strongest plant out of the collection. And pharma, I think, and VCs and biotech sort of moved to that model probably over the last decade. We've seen a lot more cheaper innovation. But the trouble is that unless you deal with the misaligned incentives that result in the kill or continue decision being biased towards continue, what you'll create is actually a legion of zombies. And in fact, that's what a lot of the sort of early stage pharma opportunities are in danger of doing. If we look at, I'm not singling them out specially because this is true across the board pretty much, but something like the Johnson & Johnson Innovation Centres and J Labs, are fantastic opportunities for increasing the breadth, because they rightly see that you've got to increase the breadth. But unless you have some powerful mechanism for then pruning out the things that you're starting, you're very soon overwhelmed in a tsunami of data that you have to try and analyse in real time to pick out the signal from the noise. So yes, the signal's gone up, but so has the noise. So your filter has to get better. And I think we're now in a phase of refinement in which people are accepting that the bread on the water approach of just tossing a little bit of resource to a million things doesn't work unless you're in a framework in which killing everything is is the default.
And do you think our filters are getting better, or are you seeing evidence of better filters around the industry?
Unfortunately, we've entered a period of something of a macroeconomic boom, particularly in the US over the last several years. And what happens is... You said
unfortunately.
I say unfortunately from an innovation perspective, because that has just resulted in essence, a return to the pick the winners kind of approach. We're seeing a really good named team of people who have pronounced that with all the predictive powers that they have, that this is going to be a wonderful thing to do, and then we'll pile a $100 million Series A into that. So I actually think there's been something of a reversal. I think the economic crash of 2007-8 actually favoured let's try a little bit of this, and then of course things are going to die because there wasn't enough resources. And if you take a garden and fertilize it heavily, everything will grow, weeds and all. So I think we did see progress towards my utopia, and I think we've seen a heavy retrenchment of that over the last couple of years.
So you're a believer in the idea of necessity being the mother of invention, and
I definitely am. Keeping people resource limited makes them think much, much more carefully about what they're doing and how that fits into the global objective. And usually the objective for a scientist can be kept close to where they currently are. So you're saying you'll get some more resources when you've achieved X, the next little thing right in front of you. And that way you can lead a horse to water. You can essentially, if you've got a solution backwards view of where you're trying to head, and you've got a team who are really talented at moving one step at a time forwards, by using resource limitation you can actually help guide them in a productive direction. Whereas if you just load them up with money, then it's somewhat unclear where they'll end up in a different place. And I'm not saying that there isn't room in the global innovation ecosystem for both kinds of models. But they have different outcomes.
Yeah, for sure. And just want to loop back to this kind of idea, because clearly you're a scientist with this kind of mantra of follow the science in discovery and development. How do you feel about pronouncements like that? That's the goal of an R&D organization, to follow the science.
Well, I don't think it is, actually. I think it's one of the pillars that you must have there, because high quality science is a sine qua non. If you can't do the science properly, and you can't interpret results, and you can't design experiments, I mean, you aren't going to get very far. But to make that the driving force of an R&D organization misses the fact that the technological piece is only one of the pillars in order to be successful.
Absolutely, and that would accord with my view. I think innovation actually is a process which involves a lot of people who don't think they're part of an innovation process, like the manufacturing, like the distribution, like the marketing folks, and a bunch of others involved in pricing and access and so on. That it takes a lot of people to get something introduced that's successful.
But I would say, interestingly, that part of the reason for that is very much because of the overemphasis of the technological hurdle in the early parts of the innovation process. I would like to think that the services that you've perhaps provided to large companies, helping them with market access and commercialization strategy, shouldn't even be necessary. The way I approach early stage innovation is I ask a question. If somebody comes to present to a VC an early pitch for a discovery stage project, for example, the first thing I'm doing is I'm just giving them the complete benefit of the doubt. I'm assuming that everything they say they can do, they'll be able to do. So let's take all the technical and give them it. Now, that may sound bonkers, but you can find a molecule that will do exactly that. Let's assume that it really does in humans what you say it will do in these animals that you've studied. Let's assume that your regulatory strategy is going to be approved and everything's going to work as well as you said. Now, does anybody want that thing? And if they do, how much would they be prepared to pay for it? And you'd be shocked how often people have got this complex technological solution that when you grant them every technological success to 100% of the degree that is possible, it's still not worth having when you've finished. And then, because people are doing that without applying that filter rigorously at the beginning, then they do get through to the end, and now they need a lot of help in order to try and seek a home, a commercially successful home for this rather unlovely thing that they create in the first place. Now, of course, we may end up there because, of course, every technological slider will not reach 100%. It's obviously not going to be true that everything they said they could do, they'll be able to do. This thing might work to 70%. I might not quite be able to remove that wrinkle, so the thing, still tastes horrible, or, is bright green with pink spots on it. It will not be the perfect entity that discovery stage people did. And I'm still going to then need, commercial support in order to get this rather unlovely thing I've created out. But if I start on a project where, having given you all the technology, the thing looks marginally saleable, and that's all the more true in early stage development, because I might be 7 years away from the market. I mean, it might just beat the current standard of care, it might just be a little bit cheaper than we're selling things for now, but the world won't look anything like what it looks now when any discovery stage project reaches the market. So if I wasn't miles above the threshold, I can't take into account the fact that what I actually produce will be worse than I hoped, and of course the bar of innovation that I've got to cross in order to be commercially successful will be higher than it is now, and so many times those two pathways have intersected long before the thing ever gets to the end, and people aren't even monitoring that. So at the moment when the inversion occurs, oh no, we'll spend another 10 million on more phase 2 trials for this thing that is already not competitive with where we're going.
For sure. And how do you feel that translates into this kind of almost gravitational pull of say a therapeutic area like Alzheimer's, which is so poorly described in terms of its biology, so poorly described in terms of its pathology, or even the way that the disease segments, but it remains this kind of vision
Yep.
on the horizon for a lot of companies. How do you feel that influences or distracts or pollutes the environment?
I think it depends on your goal. I mean, the objective for me would be to create value in a non-predictable world. So I need some intermediate, value signals, and there are none in something like Alzheimer's. So I would liken, working in a disease that does have those more predictable intermediates to show I'm on the right path is rather like building a company. You're taking risks, but you sort of know where you're going. Whereas going for Alzheimer's is rather like playing the lottery. I mean, the prize is huge, but what's the chances that the 6 random numbers that I just put into a pill are essentially going to be the right 6 random numbers? And today the approach to Alzheimer's, I think, is largely pin a tail on a donkey, on a very very large donkey.
And faith in some biology that actually probably isn't terribly well characterized in terms of its how much value the intervention plays in that biology.
I think humans again are rather poor. It's hubris again, sadly, and I'm not suggesting I don't suffer from hubris like everyone else. I'm sure I do, but I can also see the problem there, and it's just beautiful. Was there ever a need for the damn things? No. I mean, were they ever going to likely be able to deliver incremental value over what was already there? No. I mean, and demonstrably hasn't. We're proven right now. But I was saying, just because it's a beautiful, scientific and biological story, and that's where you go back to your point about, do we want to let science, should R&D be a scientifically driven phenomenon? Absolutely not, because you'll get a beautifully scientifically elegant, utterly pointless thing if you do that.
Well, and because I actually, again, I'm not breaching any confidentiality, but we spoke to one of the companies with the PCSK9 at the time, and the idea that you would use it for something that other drugs can't do, that was an interesting hypothesis. Using them for something that was defined by the market size, which is really where they wanted. They saw the statin market as a kind of place ready for diving into, and of course a lot of what they did in the clinic was then based on that.
Absolutely, it was.
Which is what money did the statins leave on the table. It wasn't based on kind of medical unmet need, if you like.
No.
Because there's a bunch of things you could do with PCSK9s that are interesting medically.
Yep.
None of which have been studied yet.
No.
And I think the likelihood is that they'll continue to do
But there are endless examples of that. I mean, what AZ have done with Brilinta is a case in point. They've gone for the whole market because clopidogrel was a fantastically successful drug with a huge market. In reality, there are 20% of people who are not well served by clopidogrel because it's actually a prodrug which is activated by a particular CYP enzyme that 20% of the population have a low activity isoform variant of. And had AZ decided that they would get 100% of the 20% by doing the clinical trial appropriately, I mean, my belief, it would be a far bigger drug in terms of area under the curve sales than it has been attempting to somehow be an expensive version of clopidogrel with at best marginal benefits. And they've been running 22,000 person trials trying to prove a 0.1% superiority in benefit event rates versus bleeding risks that may be there just about, but certainly isn't enough to sustain a 10-fold differential in price versus a generic. Yet within the subset there is a real and genuine benefit, and and PCSK9s again, if you're starting to look in people with there were subsets of people for whom statins were not the right answer, and strong clinical trial evidence there would have generated a much greater market uptake. And actually, it's easier to expand a market which exists than it is to just create a large one. I mean, if I want to create a new restaurant brand, I'm not going to take on McDonald's by simply, even if I had all the money in the world, if I just open up a new venue in every location with my new brand, it would be vastly easier to find the right formula in Derby, and iterate on the branding, the service offering till I've got that right. And once I've conquered Derby, well, then everywhere else sort of falls.
Well, we've discussed this next to the Lipitor case study. For example, Lipitor coming fifth in its class, also explored unmet need areas, clinical unmet need areas, and was cheaper than what was already on the market, and better clearly, which they largely discovered after the fact rather than before the fact. It wasn't. It wasn't necessarily set up to be better at all the things that everyone else was good at.
Well, the same thing has happened exactly with Eliquis, the factor Xa inhibitors. I mean, initially set up as a straight head-to-head comparison with warfarin, it actually doesn't look like a viable drug. It's not sufficiently better, across the entire indication where warfarin is used to justify the price differential. But, over time, with use, with further trials, people have now defined the way to use these Xa inhibitors in ways that does generate a sufficient clinical benefit in order to justify the price, and we've got an $8 billion a year drug as a consequence.
So, how important, David, do you think sort of definitions and measures of innovation are? Do you think about it in your day-to-day work, or is it a byproduct, if you like, of an approach to work that you apply?
So I definitely go about it the other way round, which is I believe that what happens is pretty much down to the incentive structure that you put in place. So I focus on believing that the general approaches we take to ensure better decision quality and better and more efficient use of resources, because those are the two principal categories. I think people say, why have we not got more innovation? If we did a quick straw poll, most people say, there isn't enough resources. Which in a sense is a silly answer, because there's never enough resources. There could always be more, and innovation has to be in competition with things like, paying pensions to, the elderly and looking after the sick and disabled. There's a constant competition of resources. So there'll only ever be so much resources for innovation. So the question is not there isn't enough, it's how efficiently do I use whatever is available to me. And therefore, to create an efficient, we are looking for frameworks to generate efficient use of resources, high quality decisions with the least amount of money spent. So when we ask, shall we generate some more data? Well, more data will probably mostly improve our decision quality. That shouldn't be taken for granted. Noise, as you do more experiments and get more information, if they're not carefully targeted, the noise could go up faster than the signal, and more data might actually result in a poorer decision-making quality. But even if it is data that will improve your decision, depending on how much it costs, you may still be better not paying for that information before you took the decision. Which in turn comes from, what am I trying to achieve? Am I more interested in whether I can be successful or in not being blamed for failure? And therefore, my approach is not a metric measurement, but trying to set incentive structures that cause people to behave in the right way, because I actually believe that most pharmaceutical R&D organizations are not set up in a way that incentivizes the right kind of behavior.
I'm going to come back to that. So talk to me a little bit about, you use the phrase decision quality, which I've written about before. What do you mean by decision quality, and how do you look for a higher quality decision?
Well, the problem, of course, is this is why metrics are hopeless, because by definition I'm only going to find out whether I was right in a long multi-step process on the fraction of those where I took the decision to keep it going. Wherever I take a decision to kill something, I never find out whether that was a good quality decision or not. Which is why I published some Monte Carlo simulations 5 or 6 years ago, because the only way to decide whether the decision quality is improving is at the global level. Am I doing better? Am I producing more good stuff? Whatever your definition of good stuff is. I mean, for a pharma company, that's going to be sales for a reducing R&D spend. The reality is they're producing slightly increasing sales on the back of massively increasing R&D budgets. So the decision quality is deteriorating by an objective measure of the system as a whole. And if you run Monte Carlo simulations of the system as a whole using, did the system produce more good stuff per dollar, and then you start to vary some of the parameters related to decision quality, you can start to understand the relationship between decision quality and expenditure.
Yeah. And do you think that the feedback loop is useful as it currently stands, or as you described it, you've got this, it's too long between outcome and
well, I can only do it in silico. I mean, I can't use the feedback loop of, I couldn't take over a large pharma company, change the way that R&D is run, and then use real metrics of sales per dollar of R&D spend, because the super tanker is only going to turn around 15 years from now. So I have to believe, in much it's about predictability, but do I believe that in silico modelling of the whole system is going to give me a better guide of how to design that R&D operation than a gut belief in predictability and the importance of science and having the very best ADME unit and the very best toxicology unit. So it comes down to a belief. I mean, can I evangelize that idea better than the guy who says, no, you need to spend more money getting better ADME people and better toxicology because you don't make a mistake here and you don't make a mistake there. I can't prove I'm right. I can model it. I can talk to you about it. It would take 15 years to collect some proof.
So given the importance of the incentive structure, you mentioned, we must incentivize people correctly to do the right things. Because I think people are working against the incentives that they have today within their organizations. What would be some of the things that you would do to change the incentive structure, either small scale or larger scale development?
Well, I wrote a piece on the DrugBaron blog, which was entitled "The Key." Managing failure is the key to success, and one of the biggest problems from an incentive perspective is what we do when something fails. There is a tendency to attribute the failure of that to the people who were actually doing the experiments that proved that it doesn't work. In reality, a good example is in venture capital. If we look at a project and I think, this is great, I'm going to put in the money, and the people give me an operating plan, I go, that looks like a sensible operating plan, and then they do it, and then it doesn't work, and in a very short period of time they've shown me that the whole idea was absolute rubbish. Who's going to suffer here? I mean, it was my faulty decision because I took the decision trying. I agreed that the operating plan was correct. They went away and executed like geniuses, and now they're left with no job and a reputation for people who are working on something that doesn't actually work, and I get to carry on investing in the next thing, and as long as I make a reasonable number of successes,
as long as one of them comes off.
And that we have to change that mentality. We have to recognize that a crack team who's capable of showing that the thing which you thought was marvelous isn't is actually what we're searching for, and we mustn't attribute to them, so it's a misattribution of the decision quality error. So which decision was wrong, mine, or did they choose to do the wrong? Discover that the design of their experiments was all wrong and they've wasted the money and we haven't proven that the thing worked. We might have discovered that they're making up the data. We might have discovered that that they just make stupid mistakes and keep dropping the cell culture flask. I mean, there are lots of ways in which you can fail, and we don't at the moment pretty much distinguish between a small biotech company that went under because they had a whole load of ham-fisted individuals, or one which went under because the entire concept on which they were working was wrong. But those are, they are worlds apart, and we have to find ways. Those ways can be, in terms of the recognition that's given to people, in terms of our use of language. These are small nudges, but just using the same word of failure to describe, those two outcomes results in people act according to those things. We don't need to change how we pay them, but just simple, changes in the language and the way in which we assess that. We can celebrate, good failure.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I've noticed that as well in the way that these things get reported, that phase 2 trials flop.
Yes.
For example, when you go, well, or it might have done exactly what it was intended to, which is to find out if it works in indication A versus B.
Yes.
But that language isn't subtle even in many cases, is it?
No. And I mean, this is a problem for the 21st century. Media do drive certain behaviours. And I think, in the words of diversity and equality, we've become very aware of the power of language to illustrate the inherent biases that we all carry around with us. For some reason, we're not recognising some much, much more glaring misuses of language, in the media. And indeed, we help them. I mean, we might not use the word flop, but, the press release might say, this has failed to meet its objective. Well, no, it didn't. It failed to meet its p-value. That doesn't mean it failed to meet its objective. It's determined whether this worked in that or not. And I think, if we don't get it right, what hope is there that the people who are then reporting on our ecosystem and amplifying those words might get it right?
Definitely. So over the time that you've worked in biotech, what have been the kind of standout things that you've learned? Next, with a view to applying those things more rigorously in future?
I think the biggest learning was the power of dissociating asset from infrastructure, idea from process. We're sitting here at RxCelerate because 5-6 years ago, we saw the problems associated with having infrastructure in a company. If you've got a drug development platform, that's expensive and difficult to build. You had to recruit some good people, you had to buy some equipment, you had to get a rental lease with somebody or other that might have 5 years in it. Huge effort involved. And once you've made all that effort, you're much less likely to go, actually, you know what, I'm not really keen on this after 6 months of the data coming through. So you are further reinforcing that kill continue decision in favour of continue. And then I learned, having seen that simple idea, that in fact there are other huge advantages to outsourcing or separating the infrastructure from the asset. We've already discussed one. It makes it clear who got it wrong. The process provider or the idea provider. So the blame is, in a sense, or the benefit is appropriately allocated. It makes the cost of every action you take explicit. If I'm using my own infrastructure that I'm paying for anyway, then if I make an animal study more complicated, add an extra couple of groups to it, there's no. I can't tell how much extra that's costing. It's just when they're all too busy, then we'll recruit another 20 people and my costs just go out of control. Once I'm outsourcing it, I'm actually asking the process provider, well, how much does it cost if I add this? And then I stop to think, good God, really? Another £10,000 just for that? That information is no way going to improve my decision quality by £10,000 worth. So I'm just not going to do it. So all of those factors have taken this sort of initial seed of an idea that having the concept and the process separate would be beneficial. It's actually proved that that's true in many ways that I probably hadn't anticipated when we started, and we're still learning.
Well, it's interesting because I think there's a hypothesis in the Innovation Illusion book, which talks about the organisation itself. Because organisations are set up to organise current sets of activity, not necessarily the right kinds of activity. And that's sort of what you're describing here, which is that as soon as you start building structures, you end up with what the structure was designed to achieve.
Absolutely, it concretes it in. And that's why it's actually better to have those nodes that we were describing, sort of an ADME and a toxicology expertise or whatever, and have them separate like different pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And then you just have to have, what we would call a project pilot, essentially somebody in a helicopter at 10,000 feet who is reassembling those capabilities in the appropriate order and in the appropriate way with the appropriate set of instructions for this particular asset. And that way there's nothing concrete about the path that has to be taken. You're making the decision on the most efficient, the lowest cost for the best decision quality at every stage, because every possibility is open to you. You've just got this constant array of pieces and you can pick and choose from them as you want.
No, it's interesting because I think the one thing that we've seen recently in pharma has been this emergence of companies that have become successful in one therapeutic area, suddenly believe that they can apply the same, fundamental beliefs or decision structures to another, and have found that they wallow or they flounder or just incapable of bringing anything through.
And bizarrely, they've responded to that then by essentially retrenching, so that even our world's largest pharmaceutical companies are now essentially operating in only 2 or 3, therapeutic areas. And that's because they've realised that process structures are not transferable, and instead of just getting rid of them and effectively becoming an open structure that doesn't impose a structure, they've said, okay, this structure actually works in oncology, so we're an oncology company.
So what do you think about retrenchment along the lines of, say, what GSK have done and saying, look, we're going to focus on these therapeutic areas to the exclusion of all else? I mean, that's this year anyway. What they say next year might well be very different. Do you think that's a sensible approach, or the opposite of a sensible approach?
Well, I suppose it depends. Like everything depends on something. It depends on your future vision for the company. If you believe that you are going to do, which I think most big pharma companies should do, which is admit that they are becoming a late stage development and commercialization organization, then it makes sense to have your areas of expertise. That's where you've got your marketing forces, that's where you understand the market dynamics, you understand patients in those areas. That becomes a real competitive advantage in those circumstances. If you want to really innovate, if you want to discover drugs any longer and do early stage development, then it's absolute madness, because you want to be working on the best projects, the best opportunities that you come across wherever they are, and actually, how I would go about discovering or developing a drug in the early stages is exactly the same no matter what the indication is. I don't need to, and because I should be looking for a project, if I'm starting discovery, that is so far above the current cutoff. I don't need this idea that I might need my marketing organisation to tell me whether this early stage development thing is going to be competitive is comical. They'll have me generate some kind of product profile or something for this thing that doesn't exist yet. It could be anything that I could write anything I like into the product profile, and then they'll do some kind of analysis and say, oh well, it would sell for $10,000, and oh no, that project isn't worth carrying out. If I need to go through that exercise, that's how my filter works. If I might need to ring somebody up and ask them about, the market dynamics in disease X, then this is no good. It's already gone.
By the right rules. No, it's interesting, because I think, as you say, there's so many myths written down onto those pieces of paper which just get baked into the whole system of the ENPV nonsense and everything that goes with it. And even though we know it's wrong all the time, it's a bit like that that old famous general quote, isn't it? I know they're wrong, just but they're useful, even if they're wrong.
Well, they are. Yes, it is. It's this idea of process again, an analysis based on data that is either meaningless or has such wide error bars on it that the outcome could range from, the value of any discovery project ranges from minus its development cost to, an almost infinite number. And nothing you can do now while you don't know what the properties of the thing is useful. But people feel comfortable if they can
people
carry
like knowing what they're doing next week.
Absolutely. And the danger then is those metrics become, they actually become part of the decision tree, and then you start making bad decisions, because instead of recognizing you're pinning a tail on a donkey, you think you're actually aiming.
Yes. What a fantastic quote. So tell me, in terms of you and your history and the choices that you've made, what is it that drives you personally within this space?
I think it is in many ways now, I think it's become an opportunity to understand the innovation mechanism in R&D. In other words, not within the companies just to make them successful, but I've got a menagerie. I've got different companies running different ways, so it's actually an experiment running of where there wasn't a pre-existing framework like there would be in a large pharma that this is how we do things here, and gradually that might evolve. Because there was nothing, and we've planted these seeds in an open field, we are refining the the model, and we're getting things wrong, and we're getting things right, and
as you should,
and learning all the time. So I think it's I think the fact that I'm serendipitously arrived in a situation where I've probably got more scope to address some of these questions that we're theorising about in practice than many people have.
So you've arrived in the kind of opposite of a monoculture in terms of the companies that you work with and ideas that you play with. So interesting diversity of thought. And
but in the end, to bring better medicines to the end, I mean that is the final goal.
And do you think, I mean, just as a sidestep, this kind of fundamental belief in certainly the West Coast of America in AI and other things as a solution to all of this, that suddenly you get better at disease prediction and targeting and so on. Do you where do you see the role of tech and AI in your world?
I think it's a hype that we're going to see a lot of. There are a few very specific applications that will work, where it will provide incremental improvement. But you have to think, what kind of problems is AI solving? Because AI makes it sound grander than it is. I mean, it's more A than I. So they're essentially just multivariate data analysis approaches. They're essentially attempts to make sorry about that, somebody just came to the door. They're essentially tools to make better predictions. And now, if you're in a low validity environment in which the predictions that can't be made because we don't actually know what's happening, then you're not going to do a very good job. If you're in a data-rich, highly predictive environment, so if I've got lots of customers coming to my website and some of them are buying and some of them are not, these kinds of multivariate models can make an excellent job of refining my website to make it better. And then for the people who do that and have been successful in it, to then come into our industry and think that at least at any kind of global level that they can make a contribution, then no. I mean, they are going to be working within these nodes and silos. They can make ADME better, they could make toxicology better, they could make in silico drug design better for sure. Can they resolve the kinds of questions we've spent the last 40 minutes talking about? No. In fact, they'll make it worse.
Because your training data are weak.
Absolutely. And no matter how good your algorithm is, you're not going to,
we've got very little, actually even awareness of what you would say was successful in the past. Never mind unsuccessful.
Well, we don't have anything to train it on for all the reasons you described, because we're comparing apples with oranges with pears. Every project is different, has different reasons why it didn't work. Every place operating it was different. There's learning algorithms require the idea that you iterated something which is comparable under different circumstances, and that just isn't true. But more importantly, the vast majority of what isn't known in a drug development project isn't because I wasn't smart enough or I haven't bothered to measure it. It actually is unknowable at that point. I'm going to have to do things in a particular order. I'm going to have to make decisions ahead of the availability of data in order to make those decisions. Now, of course, the AI people can respond and say, well, David, there's something tautologous about what you just said. I mean, if you think you can do it better, then clearly whatever it is you're doing, the machine could do. I think in the end, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think everything I do and everything I am could be produced in silico given enough time and resources. We will get there, but what we are calling AI today and what we are introducing into the drug development process today is multivariate statistics with a posh tag and a high price.
Exactly. No, I think as you say, some of these things are just fundamentally intractable problems, as in they are problems that take the time they take to resolve. It's just like asking Google what the time is and it takes 24 hours to tell you. It's like some of these things just take time to work their way through. So I know you're an avid reader. So are there books that you would recommend to anyone within either the innovation world or in the pharma R&D space?
Well, I think the books that have had the greatest impact on me haven't been, about pharma R&D, they're about my favourites are things like Freakonomics and Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. These are about realising how incentives alter people's behaviour. Those kind of books have had a huge impact on me.
Yeah. Which I completely concur with both of those suggestions, and I think actually that perspective is what's often missing from this kind of almost unilateral view of the way the pharma and discovery and development works, which is this purely scientific hypothetical approach.
Yeah, but I think in terms of the rest, it's mostly odd bits out of many different books. I mean, Black Swan, I find rather annoying in the tone of its writing, but contains some very insightful thoughts. I mean, Nassim Nicholas Taylor clearly has some very interesting thoughts. Maybe I would have communicated them slightly differently, but that everyone should read that book as well. But actually, you can go onto the internet these days, and there are interesting nuggets, paragraphs, all spread across social media, all spread on blogs. I think it's become much more diverse. 5 years ago, one tended to read books, and for many, even the books I described. I mean, even Freakonomics, Outliers. They're actually a collection of tales. They're small. They're unrelated. Points, if you like, that have been gathered together, and it is the weight of reading all of them that suddenly makes you realise the common connection, rather than books which often get written which attempt to be a synthesis somehow. And I think
textbooks of the subject.
And I think that the answer is, because we don't know how to do this. I mean, we're discussing a live and dynamic problem. How would you structure innovation in order to get a better outcome? Because there isn't an answer to that, I can't write a book that is somehow not just me. No one can write a book that somehow represents an answer. You can only look at anecdotes and discuss their relative merits. I mean, in some ways, much as we've done. So just to sign off, because I could carry on for another few hours, what are your ambitions for the next 5 years? Let's give you a 5-year horizon. I think it comes right back to where we started, which is you are essentially nowhere if you are sitting in a corner on your own and know the answer to the life, the universe, and everything. I think it's one thing me satisfying myself that I can understand how to do these things better. I need to to share that, to evangelize, to convince other people, to see changes in behaviors and in cultures resulting from the lessons which I've learned. So 5 years from now, we'll carry on innovating and incrementally innovating, but how much will we, and because this isn't just me, I mean, lots of the thoughts I'm describing today, belong to a wider ecosystem. People, at RxCelerate, we're spending a lot of time thinking about these things, learning about it. Medicxi thinking about it, and all of the time. I mean, the entire concept of separating asset from infrastructure. Francesco de Robertis and Kevin Johnson introduced me to that 10, nearly 15 years ago, and we've together been working on that ever since. So this is like the Bloomsbury set. There's a group of people, and I think to a large extent I'd count you among them. We're thinking in similar ways. Can we collectively get out there and change? Because actually we haven't changed much right now. I think we've learnt a lot, but if you look at the way the US VC market is operating, the way pharma companies are operating, does it look very different from 1999? I mean, are we any different from just before the biotech and .com crash? No, I would say we're headed for history repeating itself, and that represents a failure, even if I know why it's going wrong now. Unless we successfully persuade people to change and then see an objective response to that, we're nothing. So that's the 5 years to come.
Well, I think we can all sign up to that one. Well, thank you so much. And as I say, and if folks want to know more about you, you are very public out there at Science Scanner and the blog.
Yeah,
do you still writing it?
Yes.
Less frequent than it used to be.
Less frequently than it used to be, yes, but mainly because I feel I've said most of what needs to be said. I don't feel I want to blog just
say the same
just
things
to
every
say the
time.
same things again. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, David.
Pleasure.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mike.
All right.